Good morning, everyone. This is the third day of our National Virtual CARES Act conference here in 2022. And I know for some of you, it's early in the morning, and I had a morning session yesterday, and I'm still not quite all the way there because I normally don't really talk to people till about 10. So if you're one of those, you're not alone. But we are starting today one of our two basically CDBG classes that will be going on at the same time, where we will concentrate on the CDBG-CV program that is funded under the CARES Act. And my name is James Heyman, and I am the director of the Entitlement Communities Division. And I am joined this morning with Gloria Coates, who will also be in this session delivering some of the material. And she's a senior community planning and development specialist, part of our team. So you have two people here. One is much more of a morning person than the other one, but we will get through this first session here. I did want to welcome you and thank you for participating, not only in the conference, but in this class as well. This is a good opportunity for us to have an opportunity to reach out to a lot of our grantees and our other partners that we have, as well as some of our HUD staff, to participate in a training opportunity. And hopefully you'll get a lot out of this. Here in the morning, we'll kind of go through sort of the basics. And then as we move throughout the next 3 days, we'll dive a little bit deeper into some of these components. Can you go to the next slide? So we've got a few housekeeping slides. If you've been on the first 2 days of the conference, you have already seen these, but the PowerPoint presentations at the end will be 508 compliant, and they'll be posted on the HUD Exchange, as well as the recordings from the conference, so that you can go back through those at any time you want to. And if you want to just look at one session, you can do that as well. There is the show captions button down at the bottom if you choose to do that, or if you need to, so that you can follow along. And also there is the attendee guide that has the resource page, gives you a little more information if you get kind of lost. Next slide. As far as questions, we're going to be kind of balancing between the platform on our side. So Sidon will be helping us move questions into the Q&A, but if you could focus on putting in any questions you have in the Q&A, that would be great. And you can do that throughout the presentation. You don't have to wait to the end. And we'll try to pause here and there so that we can take questions and try to get everyone answered. If not, we'll be gathering the questions at the end and taking a look at them. But please do that throughout the session. When a thought comes up, again, you don't have to wait to the end. Next slide. So you do have the chat function down at the bottom. We would prefer you use the Q&A. Anything that goes into the chat, we'll try to get that moved over so we can look at it. And then you have the event support email there as well, if you need assistance. Next slide. We do have some polls throughout the training. We actually are going to have one here in a minute. So you'll be able to take advantage of that. Again, if you're looking at the page of broadcast, this would be down towards the bottom, which is where that blue bar is at. Next slide. So again, a little more information if you want to use a separate tab, or if you want to use a tablet or a smartphone at the same time, you can use Slido for that. On your smartphone and your tablet, you just download the app and you just punch in the number, and that will take you actually to the session. Next slide. All right, so this is our first poll that we have. So what is your level of distinguishing CDBG-CV requirements from CDBG requirements? You've got one of three choices. By the way, there is the Slido code on the screen there while you're answering. All right, so it looks like the poll has settled down. So majority of our folks here are in the some experience section. So the good thing is we'll cover that over the next 3 days. Another thing that is good news is that if you're familiar with CDBG, CDBG-CV is not that much different, other than we have waivers and suspensions and an extra tieback documentation that you need to have. So it is a separate program, but it's not completely foreign if you have some CDBG experience. Let's go to the next slide. All right, so we're going to cover just a brief overview of the program, and then we're going to move into actual planning your program out. Next slide. All right, so where does the CDBG program actually get its authority? Well, it's from that Title I of the Housing and Community Development Act of 1974. And there are plenty of copies of the law itself. It's thicker than your old phone books, which I don't even know if they even print phone books anymore. I might be dating myself. There may be people on here who have never seen a phone book. You might have to go to a museum. But we're just a small section of those community development laws. But we have been around since 1974. The CDBG program was created from a bunch of other programs, open space land program. There was a public facilities loan program, and you can see how they brought together pieces and parts of all of these programs into the statute itself. And there are specific elements that exist within the regulations, which are from some of those older programs. As I talked yesterday morning, there are some carve outs in the ineligible activities that you can see from that public facilities loan program and one of the public services programs that existed that were brought in. And primarily our regulations are existing in that 24 CFR Part 570, which is broken into various sections to incorporate the various CDBG programs that we have. We're primarily going to be focused on the entitlement program here, but we do have a section that goes over the state program as well. So that's where we're housed at in there. One thing I will note is that we do refer to the CDBG program as the annual formula program. Sometimes you may hear people say the regular CDBG program. That's because this is a very flexible chassis that all of these other programs are built off of. If you know, the recovery housing program uses the HCDA as its chassis, if you will. If you've been around for a while and you know about the NSP program, same thing there. The CDBG disaster recovery supplemental appropriations use that, as well as the CDBG-CV program. Because of its flexibility and because of the wide array of activities that you can fund with CDBG, it's often used by Congress for the supplemental appropriations. Next slide. So this is straight from the first section of the statute. So the primary objective of the program is to focus on having viable urban communities. And our main focus is on low to moderate income persons. We are a low to moderate income program. We do have a 70% of the funds of the grant must be expended for low to moderate income activities to serve those persons. And for CDBG-CV, we kept that intact so that 70% of your grant over its life must be expended for those low to moderate income population, because that's who we serve. That's actually what makes CDBG different than the 17 or 18 other community and economic development programs that exist within the federal portfolio. And within the statute, it goes on to describe that we have these three focuses. That is decent housing, suitable living environment, and expanded opportunity with a specific focus on that population. Next slide. So now we can talk a little bit here about the CARES Act and how CDBG-CV came about. So if you rewind your memory way back to March of 2020, which seems like a long time ago, and well, it's been almost 2 years now, that is when the CARES Act was signed into law. It's been interesting for us in the Office of Block Grant Assistance. I was actually talking with a group yesterday, and we started our outreach to our field offices and to our grantees on March 13th, right before it was signed. We knew at that point that that was coming and went ahead and started our engagement with what processes grantees should start to put into place in order to prepare to make application for that funding. So that was signed into law, and we were already underway putting things together, which has been a good thing for our grantees. And underneath the CARES Act, as you're aware, the CDBG program did receive a supplemental appropriation of $5 billion so that we could create the CDBG-CV, or its longer form is CDBG-coronavirus. So CV is much shorter for us to say. That's where this program came from. And one of those specific requirements in the CARES Act is that all of our funds are designed to prevent, prepare for, and respond to coronavirus. And that's a mouthful as well. So you'll often hear here in the training or any of the documents that we publish, you'll see just PPR in there, which is much easier to roll off of the tongue. So CDBG-CV has other requirements that are attached to it. And we also had the ability to exercise our waiver authority underneath the Housing and Community Development Act, as well as some of these waivers and suspensions were given within the CARES Act itself for the program. Next slide. So that is where the CDBG-CV program exists there in that specific section of the CARES Act. It's not incredibly long, which is a good thing for us as a program, because then that allows us the flexibility when we're given the authority to come up with an implementation notice that further describes how we expect the program to be implemented. And it also gives us the opportunity to provide other waivers and alternate requirements to our grantees to make it easier for you all to implement the program, but also to make clear any kind of expectations that we have with the performance of that. That is the citation there on the screen. That is our Federal Register notice. It is located on HUD.gov, as well as there's a link on the HUD Exchange. Now, within the CARES Act, we have the flexibility to use your annual program funds with fiscal year 2019 and 2020, that you could use some of that money to PPR to the coronavirus and take advantage of the waivers and suspensions that do exist within the notice and within the CARES Act itself. One that grantees have in particular taken advantage of early on is that the public service cap was lifted. We did provide a number of alternate requirements and waivers in the notice around economic development, expectations on how you would document your urgent need, national objective, and some other things in there. So grantees have the flexibility. Having said that, you're also required to amend your most recent approved plan within the notice. And the CARES Act was specific that you could use either your 2019 or your 2020 to do that, to stick that program in there. Kind of caught grantees in a situation where we were in the middle of making new grants for 2020. So a lot of grantees went with their 2019 unless they were able to get their allocation for 2020 and have a plan that was accepted by HUD. Next slide. So primary objectives that exist. Again, you're probably going to hear this a lot. I feel like we've probably said this millions of times over the last almost 2 years now, but that prepare, prevent, respond for that, that is crucial for those activities. It's also crucial for your 2019 and 2020 funds that you use. And we have fully incorporated CDBG-CV into IDIS. I know in yesterday, we had 2 sessions yesterday on IDIS that went through setting up an activity all the way through your CAPER reporting at the end. So you know by now that there is a flag in there that you would click for CDBG-CV, which would allow your 19 and 20 funds to be pulled out of that calculation for the public service cap. And also so that you and HUD can track and see what's being spent towards addressing the coronavirus. So any of your activities that you can't PPR, of course, aren't eligible for CDBG-CV, and your 19 and 20 funds cannot count towards that either. So that tieback, documenting that tieback is a crucial element in the CARES Act. And we did put out a document that should be in the resource section here on the website for the conference. If not, we'll make sure that gets put up, that we affectionately refer to as the PPR tieback document. It goes through and lists out some suggested ways that you could document the tieback. I will say there's not one way of doing it. You certainly have flexibility in doing so, but it is crucial that you have that documentation to tie that document back, if you will, to how it addresses the coronavirus. So, and as a note, if you look at that PPR tieback document, or as you have inquired of HUD, we did not prohibit any activities. There are a lot of activities you can do with the CDBG program, and we opted to not say you can't do this or you can't do that. We left it wide open, mainly because we had no idea what grantees were going to do. And we also were well aware that you have a 6-year life cycle, if you will, on your grant. And the idea here is that you would respond immediately to the coronavirus, and then you would move on to other phases where you would be focusing on preventing and preparing, so that your activities hopefully would be set up in a way that they would evolve over time, that you would have your immediate or your emergency response with your program design, and then you would move into the areas focused on community sustainability or economic recovery, so that you could take advantage of the other waivers and alternate requirements that we have set up. That way you can have your program evolve as your situation does within your particular community, and take advantage of that 6-year period as you roll your program out over that time. Next question, please, or next slide. So we're going to talk next few slides here about key partners and actually implementing your program with a particular intent. So We have our typical portfolio here, our entitlement communities, which are the cities and urban counties. We have our states who have the ability under the CARES Act to act directly. And they also have their normal mode of business, if you will, which is to use units of general local government, or as we shorten that as another acronym, we call them UGLUGs, which I realize is kind of a clunky term, but they would be the sub-grantees of the state, if you will. So states have flexibility here to be just like under the NSP program. They could act directly if they wanted to, or they could go ahead and use their UGLUGs. And as I said, we do have a state-specific section. We'll go over those requirements a little bit more. One of the other things I'll mention here as well is that we do have the insulars also received funding. So if we go back and we look at how we actually allocated out the CDBG-CV grants themselves, they were in 3 tranches. And that first tranche, if you will, we were directed to use our 2020 data set to make an allocation based on that, just like we did our 2020 grants. And then for the second and third tranches, the formula was changed slightly. And you can go to the HUD Exchange or HUD.gov, and we were transparent in that we posted those formulas. And we also posted the grant allocations for all 3 tranches on there. The other aspect here that is a carryover from the annual formula CDBG program is you still have subrecipients, community-based development organizations, or as we call them, CBDOs, and you also have community development finance institutions, or CDFIs, that are available, as well as contractors. You can still use those. Next slide. All right, so how do we actually define what a subrecipient is? So that public or private nonprofit organization will be the ones receiving funding from the jurisdiction itself. In this case, a subrecipient is a term of art that exists within the entitlement program. It also exists for our Hawaii grantees as well as our insular grantees. And that's kind of broken down where you can look using for-profit agencies that assist with those micro enterprises or institutions of higher education or higher learning, depending on how you want to look at that. And of course, that nonprofits that acquire rehab residential housing, that, you know, they're not considered subrecipients if that's the only thing they do. And often grantees will pair that up with the CBDOs or with CHODOs in the home program so that they can leverage funding from over on their side. So who's not a subrecipient? And this is where we would get into some of the nuances of the regulations that will be covered. We're just going to briefly do an overview here, but those CBDOs, they're not a subrecipient unless you decide to make them such. Any of your procured contractors are not subrecipients. Again, if you were involved in the NSP program, a lot of grantees were familiar with how to use contractors. And of course, your beneficiaries, those that are actually receiving CDBG benefit, they're not subrecipients, they're just beneficiaries. So those are the heads that you would be counting that receive benefit that you would report in IDIS. Next slide. All right, so subrecipient agreements. And I will note as well that for those who are using, say, your Parks and Recreation Department or something like that within your city or county, it would be very important for you to take this subrecipient agreement and adopt it for an interdepartmental agreement. That way you have all of these things in place for monitoring as well as accountability and reporting. But these agreements are written, and most places have sort of a boilerplate template that they would be working from. that one of their local attorneys looked over and kind of gave it the nod, if you will. These are, for the most part, going to be particular for that activity that you have. So your boilerplate is your starting place. Our requirements are a minimum. You may choose to add additional requirements as long as you're not contradicting the Housing and Community Development Act, the regulations, or any of the program related requirements that are around civil rights or equal opportunity. But you're going to focus here on exactly what you want that subrecipient to do, which is going to start with your statement of work. That's where you're actually going to define out what is the activity, what are the expectations for its completion, who is it going to serve, what is it going to do, and for how long is it going to do it. You also want to make sure you include any documentation or records that they are being expected to keep and maintain, as well as how often you want them to report. And your reporting is going to be key because that's what you'll have to do on the back end. So you want to make sure that that is established in there so that you're not waiting to the end. So if you have an activity that, say, takes you 2 or 3 years, you don't want to get to the end and go, well, we forgot to keep all of our reporting documentation. You want that expectation to be clear within that agreement. Also, our regulations clearly define how program income is to be treated. And as you know, with the CDBG-CV program, any program income that is earned is going to be moved over to your annual formula CDBG program. So for CDBG-CV, that must be included in there, as well as how they're going to track their program income, how often they would move it over, and how they would report it. So we have our uniform administrative and other federal requirements. This is, as you see the citation down at the bottom in 503 outlines all of those that should be included in there, as well as you're looking at suspension and termination. We refer to that often as the sanction portion of that, which is you need to have the ability to exercise that authority as well so that you can suspend or terminate the activity for performance or other reasons, as well as your reversion of assets. This is where you would get into supplies and property that would be acquired with the grant and how they are to be treated, as well as your faith-based organization requirements that are in there. That's section 503. If you're not familiar with it, I would definitely review that, as well as our various manuals that we have outline those minimum requirements that we have in terms of what's applicable to the CDBG program, because you're also looking at Uniform Relocation Act that comes into play, the civil rights and some of the other ones, Davis-Bacon. Everybody loves Davis-Bacon. The environmental requirements, all of those things are going to be noted, and you'll be directed to more thorough sections and other pieces of the laws and regulations. Next slide. All right, so CBDOs. A lot of grantees are familiar with CDBGOs. Some of them are not. I will note there that where it sits in the entitlement regulations in 504, this actually comes out of the statute itself in a very slim piece. In section 105A15 of the Act, or 105A rather, is where the activities are at, what we refer to as the enumerated activities for the CDBG program exist. 105A15 is where you'll find those neighborhood-based organizations, or as they've been implemented in the entitlement program, the CBDOs. So our regulation there at 570-504 outlines very thoroughly how CBDOs are to be set up and what they can do. These three things that are noted here on the screen are straight from the Act. This is what the Housing and Community Development Act tells us that they can do. This is, if you will, where they're to stay between the ditches. So they'll be choosing that neighborhood revitalization community economic development, or energy conservation. Those are the three categories, and they have to choose one of those. I will say that these are fairly vague terms, if you will, which is okay, because that gives the grantee as well as the CBDO plenty of room to fit things underneath one of those three categories as they've defined, and how they would be outlined and exactly what they would be doing within the community. So that's your space. You got to choose one of those three broad categories and define specifically what the CBDO would be doing. Next slide. All right, so as we mentioned a couple slides back, that CBDO is not a subrecipient unless you designate it as such. Now, there are certain things that are in the regulations that kind of give CBDO some leadways, and to just mention a few of those, a CBDO can keep its program income. That reversion of assets, it's not applicable to a CBDO unless you treat them as a subrecipient. So there are advantages and disadvantages of how you use a CBDO. You have incredible flexibility with a CBDO. As soon as you make them a subrecipient and treat them as such, you start to lose some of that flexibility. So it depends on how you want to use them. It depends on the nature of the activity and how close you want to keep that relationship with that CBDO. If you want to treat them more as a subrecipient, you're free to do so. Again, that's just another flexibility within the program, where that nature of that relationship is something that you're able to make that determination up front. Next slide. So community development financial institutions, or CDFIs. So these are based within a particular community. They are managed by the Treasury, and CDFIs do have a great deal of flexibility in terms of what exactly they could be used for within your community. In other words, they can make loans in LMI areas that some institutions would not be able to take care of. They may not serve that particular population, but CDFIs can do that. I know in DC and in other locations, there are CDFIs that have gotten involved in the last 8 to 10 years in micro loans and things like that. Those are definitely something that you wouldn't be running down to JP Morgan Chase and asking for a micro loan for a business in your community, but your CDFI can serve that need. So this gives you a way, if you will, to kind of look at grassroots capital development within a particular community. And those CDFIs tend to be very mission driven in that they are focused on promoting and investing in a targeted area within your community. And they also have that, given their level that they operate on, the accountability, if you will, to the targeted area that they serve is there as well. Now, I will note that these are not an agency of the government. These are independent. If you look at it another way as well, a lot of CDFIs are the ones who would be receiving tax credits that they are administering within these particular areas in order to focus on, say, affordable housing development or historic preservation. Next slide. So with those flexibilities, as you incorporate them into your program design, if you choose to do so, our regulations outline a lot of the special considerations that we have with them and their flexibilities. And one of the opportunities that you have there is that they can aggregate those jobs underneath the low to moderate income job national objective that are created or retained for all the businesses within that target area. And we do have a financial management section. I believe it is tomorrow I may be wrong. 5 days is a lot of agenda for me to remember. But in our financial management section that we have, we'll be going over not only the waivers and alternate requirements that we have around economic development, but you'll have an opportunity to ask more questions about CDFIs and other ways in which you can do economic development within targeted areas. Next section. All right, Gloria, is this you or is this still me? I think this might still be me. So we're going to be talking about the actual, one of my colleagues told me that financial management is Friday morning. So thank you for that. So as you go through and you're looking at choosing your activities, our next section, Gloria, will be talking about the planning process and putting that together. But here are some thoughts for you to keep in mind as we go into this next section. You need to choose who you're going to use. So you're going to use subrecipients only, or you're going to move into that CBDO and CDFI space. And typically our grantees have got these 4 models that they choose from, which is your straight RFP, as a lot of you are kind of familiar with. The limited application, or you're going to use an RFQ. One of the things I would caution you against is having a manageable process, if you will. So if you look at that last option as an open door, unsolicited process, or as some people often refer to that as a rolling application process, where throughout the year you'll receive applications for the various categories that you are looking at funding. You have to consider your capacity of your organization. Now, I was a grantee on the city, the county, the state, and regional level, and we often found that it was much easier for us to have a formal process where we had defined time periods in terms of when we would receive applications and when we would get them done, because we had a very small staff. And when you only have a few people and you have a rolling application process, it is very hard to not only design and manage your program, but you often will find yourself in a space where you may be behind on your expenditures. And we do have the timeliness test, if you will, on the annual formula side, not on the CDBG-CV side. But you have to bear in mind that CDBG-CV is not your only grant. You still have your annual formula grant as well. So as you must maintain your expenditures on your annual formula side, you have to consider that with how you're actually implementing your CDBG-CV program. In other words, you need to ask yourself, are we doing too much? Is our capacity stretched to a point where we're not able to perform at a level where we can meet the needs of our community? Most of our larger grantees are kind of using a combination of that. And I would say on the CDBG-CV side, we are seeing a combination of methods that are put into place with receiving applications. In particular, it's because you have a 6-year window to implement your program. So as I mentioned earlier, you should be moving from responding to coronavirus to having a more long-term mindset where you're preventing and preparing in terms of your activities. So you'll be evolving in your design. So it's expected that you may be able to change how you started implementing your CDBG-CV program to a model that is more in tune with what the needs of your community are. Next slide. All right, at this point, I am going to hand it over to Gloria, and Gloria will take care of you. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, James. Good morning, everyone. We're going to talk about the comp plan, which most of you probably already know about, but we're going to discuss not only some annual appropriation or regular CDBG fund activity, things with regard to the consolidated plan, but we're also going to mention some of the CDBG-CV flexibility. Next slide, please. Okay, this is your basic definition of a consolidated plan. You notice here it says 3 to 5 year plans. And they identify the grantee, your priorities for community development and multi-year goals, hence the 3 to 5 year, based on assessment of the things identified here. Needs to address homelessness, community development needs, economic development, affordable housing, for example, whatever the needs of your communities are. And usually when this is developed, it's developed not just by you, but also it's also something that you take before the citizens as it's being developed so that you can get their input. Hence, the community needs determine what activities they're going to fund with input from stakeholders and the public. Now, stakeholders are not just your, everyone. A lot of those are the businesses that are in various areas, the nonprofit organizations, community organizations, health clinics, your health services, and many other types of entities that can, weigh in during a public hearing on the needs of a community. Next slide, please. Okay, this is basic information, talks about what makes up your consolidated plan. The strategic plan is the most important, well, I'm gonna say the most important, but it's very important because it's where you're gonna decide what you're gonna do over the 3 to 5 year period. Now, most grantees have a 5-year consolidated plan. I do not know any that have a 3, so for the purposes of this, we'll just presume that they're all 5 years. The entity that's carrying out the CDBG and CDBG-CV program will be identified here, as well as these factors that will be identified. When the grantee prepares its consolidated plan, you notice here it says 1-year action plan. The first year of that 5-year plan is embedded into the consolidated plan. That's why a lot of times we call it consolidated plan, action plan, because that first year's plan is embedded therein. Next slide, please. Okay, as we discussed, you must have citizen participation. I'm sorry, I dropped my papers on the floor, I'm picking them up. Citizen participation is critical. If you, as a grantee, develop a consolidated plan without citizen input, HUD will not approve that plan because that's a statutory requirement that citizens be given the opportunity to participate. And grantees are aware that also your citizen participation plan identifies how citizens may participate. HUD does review and approve the consolidated plan. And, here we're really talking about the annual program. HUD has to review it and approve it. But it has to be submitted to the local field office at least 45 days before the start of the program year, unless the field office authorizes an exception that allows a grantee to submit it later. However, under no circumstances can a grantee be given an extension to submit a plan later than August 16th, because that's a statutory date, and it cannot be amended or suspended. We'll get into the CARES Act in a minute because it actually gave a whole 1-year extension, but you notice they didn't change the date, that August 16th date. Grantees can make, as you know, regular substantial amendments to its consolidated plan as well as the annual action plan. When the grantee prepares its CAPER, which we'll get into in a few minutes, what's in that consolidated plan with those strategic goals and the activities that they carried out, they're measured against what the grantee actually did. And I guess if I'm speaking generally, forgive me, I'm used to talking to field officers rather than grantees. So forgive me that. I'm trying to change so that I realize I'm speaking directly to grantees. Next slide, please. Okay, now we're going to get into the CV part of it. Okay. Grantees were encouraged, but not required. I thought it was required, but I had to go back and look at the notice to make sure that I wasn't making an error here. They were encouraged to do a substantial amendment to their most recently approved consolidated plan action plans when they apply for their first round of funding for CDBG-CV, also known as CDBG-CV1. Although grantees, most of them did do the most recently approved, which for most of them at that time were the 2019, because the CARES Act extended the date until August 16, 2021. Some grantees took advantage of that, meaning that they didn't do their most recently approved. The 19 may have been approved, but they decided to wait and submit it with the 2020. Now, to apply for CV funds, you were only allowed to do a substantial amendment to the 2019 or 2020 plans. That's a provision in the CARES Act. There's no waiver of that provision. We've had grantees ask us, well, what about 2021? The pandemic is still here, and we still want to carry out activities to address coronavirus. Of course you can. You just have to do an amendment to the plan that you initially submitted your substantial amendment, as it says here at the bottom, from subsequent rounds, because a lot of grantees did receive CDBG-CV, what we call CV3. CV2 was limited to the District of Columbia and states. So for entitlements, and I work in the entitlement division, so that's kind of my bias. They had to make you were required to make a substantial amendment to the same plan. We had grantees that asked, well, can I make a substantial amendment to the 19 plan and then do another one to the 2020? No. If you amended the 19 plan to apply for your CV1, then when you apply for CV3, you had to do another substantial amendment to your 19 plan. Next slide, please. Okay, these are the waivers that were issued. We're going to talk a little about those because they are important. And waivers were issued to allow you to provide your citizens with the opportunity and ability to comment on substantial amendments for CV for not less than 5 days. That provision was from the CARES Act, and so it was statutory. A minimum of 5 days had to be provided for citizen comment. If you did not do that, then you may have been instructed by your field office to go back out and do it again and make sure this time it's 5 whole days. Understanding that addressing the pandemic was an emergency. However, statutory requirements can't be waived and they must be met. So The waivers also allowed grantees, you all, to determine what you consider to be reasonable notice and opportunity to comment, given the circumstances that you had regarding the pandemic for the 2020 program year. And a lot of the waivers that were given, as you see below, the provisions that were waived are identified below. And these are provisions are regarding substantial amendments for entitlements in states. And I believe 401 is for consortia. But these were the provisions that were waived that allowed grantees not to have to do 30 days, but to do 5 days for any amendment made to either 19 or 20 to address coronavirus. Next slide, please. Okay, another thing that the CARES Act provided for was the ability to hold virtual hearings. For as long as the program has been in existence, grantees held public hearings available to all members of the public. Virtual hearings are a little different, but they still must be made available to all. But a lot of grantees use platforms such as Zoom, Slack, Teams, and many others to hold their virtual hearings. Because that is also a statutory requirement that can't be waived, the CARES Act required that the hearings be made virtual rather than do away with them because of the coronavirus. The ability to hold virtual hearings was allowed for CV and 19 and 20 CDBG grants for as long as national or local health authorities recommended social distancing and limiting public gatherings for public health reasons. Now, I will say this, we're in 2022 and the pandemic is still among us. We have not issued any guidance, I'll put this out there first, regarding 2022. But as long as this requirement is met and it can be documented, there's no reason why a grantee could continue to hold virtual hearings if it's necessary. Now, a lot of grantees have resorted to holding in-person hearings again. They can if they would like to do so. The CARES Act just makes virtual hearings as a method of citizen participation. And of course, it must be in your citizen participation plan as a method of citizen participation. For example, we will be using Zoom, we will be using Slack, we will be using Facebook Live, we will be using Instagram Live, whatever the platform is for your virtual hearings. You can still publish those things, for example, in a newspaper if they still have them in your area, or, maybe as a TV ad for those who probably don't, probably wouldn't know otherwise. But these virtual hearings were required so that citizens would still be able to have input with regard to what grantees were deciding to fund with the CV dollars. And one of the things that the CARES Act mandated is that it had to be done in real time where people could actually ask a question to an official and the official was required to give an answer. In other words, it wasn't where you submitted a question and you had, the citizen and they had to wait. Someone had to be there to be able to address their questions with regard to activities. And also, not only just the person asking the question, but everybody had to be able to see the questions and the answers that were being provided. Next slide, please. Okay, more waiver authority. 91-505 requires grantees to submit their substantial amendments to HUD for review and, for review. And that reg also requires they can either submit substantial amendments. They don't have to get HUD approval for the regular program. They can submit them either as they occur, the regs say, or at the end of the program year. However, for CV, this provision was waived so that when CV amendments were provided to HUD field offices, they had to be reviewed and approved before the activities could be carried out. Whereas with the regular program, you can do a substantial amendment whenever you like and submit it, as I said, either when you do it or at the end of the program year. Also, the documents below were required when grantees were applying for this, when you were applying for your CV grants. Now note that these are the same things that you normally submit when you apply for your annual appropriation CDBG grant, but you had to resubmit them also to receive your CV grants. Next slide, please. Okay. This was something else that was waived. When grantees submit their plans, they have to certify that the housing activities that they take out with these formula funds, we call them CPD formula grant funds, they have to be consistent with the strategic plan portion of the comp plan. However, that provision was waived. The pertinent regulation that was waived is below for entitlement and states for your information. The requirement that HUD put in place allows grantees to submit those certifications when you submit your next full consolidated plan that's due after the 2020 program year. A lot of grantees had their consolidated plans expire and they started 2020 to 2024, which they probably had sent out for citizen participation before the pandemic, probably particularly the January ones, before we knew about coronavirus. And so those grantees, since they had to do, if they did an amendment to their 2020, they can submit those certifications when they're doing the 2025 to 2029 plan. Next slide, please. Okay, reporting requirements. These are as important as, the development of the consolidated plan. For the entitlement program, it's called a CAPER. For the state program, it's called a PER. Additional information on the state PER can be found in this notice. And as you all are aware, I don't have to emphasize this too much, but that whatever activities you carry out during a program year, regardless of the funding source from which you use, they have to be reported on in the CAPER. For example, if a grantee decided to wait and apply for its 2020 grant, August 16, 2021, we had a lot of grantees that did do this, which means they didn't have a 2020 grant for a while or CV. And so they were still carrying out activities in the meantime. They probably were using 18 funds, 19 funds. And these activities didn't address coronavirus because they were started before the pandemic. And so they just continued to carry them out during the pandemic. So You know, they still would have, they would still have activities to report on. They probably just weren't carried out with that year's money. Next slide, please. Okay. As you all know, there are two major parts to every CAPER and PER. You have to identify the progress you made on the elements, the strategic goals, and other things like AFFH and analysis of impediments. Also, you have your PR 26 financial reports that you have to submit as well. These reports, as you know, identify the activities carried out and the amount of money expended on each, and they are also used to determine compliance with the caps. Next slide, please. Okay. As you know, the regulations state that 90 days after the end of your program year, you submit your CAPER. Before you submit it to HUD, however, your citizens have to be given 15 days to review it. Now, the CARES Act did not shorten this. The CARES Act did not address this. So the regulatory requirements in Part 91 remain effective for this. Citizens have to be given 15 days. And whatever comments the citizens make on that CAPER or PER, those have to be summarized by you, and you have to be able to provide a final report to the public. In other words, a final CAPER with all of the comments that were made by citizens. Now note that grantees that submitted substantial amendments to their 2019 action plans to apply for CV, they were given 180 days versus 90 days to submit their 2019 CAPERs. And this authority was given by a memo that was issued by HUD, signed by John Gibbs, who was the Assistant Secretary at that time. Next slide, please. Record keeping. Okay, record keeping is very, very critical. Once you get to the monitoring section on Friday, you'll see just how important record keeping is. You ever heard document, document, document? Everything must be documented, particularly compliance with the requirement to document the tieback to the pandemic for CV activities. These are the type of records that have to be kept. And as you know, the more the better, but they have to be strong and comprehensive. You can't, you know, I've seen receipts from Home Depot. I mean, you know, now that's another whole story with procurement. We won't go there. But it's very important that the grantee document, that you document the eligibility of the activity and that a national objective is met. Those are statutory requirements. And also, as stated, for any CV activities to tie back to the pandemic. As James said, we're not prohibiting you all from carrying out any activities identified in the statute or the regulations, as long as it can be tied back to the pandemic. Now, I will say that some activities can be tied back to the pandemic much easier than others. And there are some that seem to not have any type of tie back to the pandemic. But HUD doesn't tell you what to do. It's up to you to determine what you're going to carry out and to be able to document it and have this strong and comprehensive filing system so that when you're monitored and HUD requests records, you'll have all the records you need. Anything that assists HUD in monitoring to determine compliance, checklists, logs, cross-indexing, whatever it is, that makes it easy for the HUD reviewer to be able to come in and review your file system is encouraged. Next slide, please. Record retention. Now, when you go to 2 CFR Part 200, it talks about 3 years. But if you go to 24 CFR 570-502, it'll tell you, except it has to be 4 years rather than 3 years from the date of execution of either the closeout agreement or from a for example, an agreement between a grantee and a subrecipient, or a grantee and a CBDO, or whatever the entity, or even what we call local public agencies designated by grantees to carry out eligible activities such as housing authorities. States and UGLUGs have to do it for 3 years. But anything where you have reversion of assets, usually 570-503B7 for subrecipients, or 570-505 for grantees. We do have grantees that relinquish their entitlement status, and they eventually will have to close their grants out. But once the requirements have been made and fulfilled for reversion of assets, payback, return of the property, or whatever it is, for 3 years after that requirement's been met, then they no longer have to keep the records. However, it's recommended that for as long as they can, I mean, it's okay to keep it 4 or 5 years if you think you're going to need it, for some other provision, for some other reason, and or if local requirements require longer record keeping. Anything that can't be closed out because they're outstanding loan balances or contingent liabilities, until those things are satisfied, the records have to be retained. And then once they're satisfied, they have to be maintained for a minimum of 3 years. Now, I know that sounds like a lot of paper and a lot of, space, but it's better to have the documentation on hand than not. Also, public access to records. The Part 200 requirements state that citizens is sent to CFR, it's in the 300s. It says the citizens have to have reasonable access and provided timely information with regard to records. In other words, just as citizens can review action plans, comp plans, capers, and so forth, they can request to access your records. The Part 200 requirements also state that not only HUD, but the IG and Comptroller General must also have access to your records. Next slide, please. Okay. Record keeping question. Okay. Why is record, now I know we just talked about it. So I would like to get your feedback. Why is record keeping important for CDBG and CV grantees and their subrecipients? Ladies and gentlemen, it looks like you all have hit the nail on the head. Most of you, okay, I see the numbers are going up and all they're going down with all of the above. And actually, all of the above is the correct answer. I see people going back and forth between if it is not documented, it did not occur. And actually, a lot of reviewers or monitors may actually take that stance. If you don't have any documentation for this activity, it didn't happen. Or if you have no documentation that these people assisted with low and moderate income, then they weren't assisted. That means that you can, that it may be determined that you did not meet a national objective. You don't want that to happen because the usual remedy for that is payback of the grant. Next slide, please. Okay, CDBG eligible activities. Okay. As you can see, this presentation kind of has a CDBG regular program, CDBG/CV theme to it, where you see what the normal requirements are and what the CV requirements are, because there are some differences because of waivers. And as you all know here, when you look at the eligible activities, there are a lot of activities that can be carried out. If you go to the statute, they're in 105A. If you go to the regs, here are the reg sites. But there will be modules on each of these eligible activities with regard to not only CDBG, but also to CDBG-CV. Next slide, please.
That's your last content slide, Gloria.
Okay, I'm sorry. Once I dropped my papers on the floor, I kind of lost track. Okay, so it looks like the next one is me again with housing and other real property activities, if I'm not mistaken. That's what my schedule shows me.
Correct. The next session is 11:15 a.m. where we will be covering housing and real property activities in both rooms. But at this point, you and your co-presenter James can make any other comments you want regarding this topic, or we can ask the audience if they have any questions about what was just covered in this session to please ask them, and we can let y'all respond since we have a little bit of time left in this session.
Okay, well, I welcome any questions.
Yeah, so if we open up the Q&A box there, Gloria.
Okay, I think I answered one while you were talking.
Yeah. So we have a few in there. Someone wanted to add that it would keep us out of HUD jail.
I thought, yeah, you're right.
Yeah, we don't have a jail cell in the Office of Block Grant Assistance, but the Inspector General, when I was a grantee, we called them the HUD cops, and there might be somebody from the OIG on right now, but yeah, that's a good thing. You want to stay out of jail. So let me ask you this question, Gloria. If we use an RFP process, so if we're using an RFP process, the select an organization, are they considered a contractor? Or can we consider the organization a subrecipient? I know an RFP/procurement process is not required to select a subrecipient.
All righty. When you're using a request for proposals, you are actively procuring a contractor to provide you with goods and/or services, and they are considered contractors. They're not considered subrecipients in any way. And contractors are not subject to our HUD requirements, for example, program income and other things. I mean, the Part 200 requirements do allow profit to be built in, but it has to be reasonable in accordance with, again, 2 CFR Part 200. So they cannot be considered subrecipients, no matter which procurement method you choose. And now they even have those that don't require actual requests for proposals, you know, your very small ones, your micro purchases, where you can select among 3 or more service providers for those same, you know, for those goods and or services. But if you do so, you have to document that you're, excuse me, that you had these, let's say 5, you know, A, B, C, D, and E, to provide you with, let's say, floor towels. Floor towels cost $2,000. Okay, that's in line with the micro. Okay, and you look at how much each person said that, you know, I'm not good with numbers, so 10 by 10 floor towels will cost $300, and you get 500, you get, you know, depending, but they're all the same, you know, towels. And you have to document why you went with, let's say, provider B. And therefore, you've met the requirement, but that's considered a micro purchase. Procurement will come later in the presentation. I don't think I'm presenting on it. I may be, but I mean, I can, but you know, there are a couple of the Part 200 requirements have been updated, and some of those numbers have changed. And if I'm not mistaken, RFPs are required for anything over 250,000. That leaves a wide variety of things that can be done by small purchase and or micro purchase. But they have to, you know, the regs in 2 CFR 200-320 tell you what you have to do with regard to selecting contractors.
Okay, so here's another one for you. If a homeowner repair program provides information on street addresses, as this is PII, is this exempt from public records request?
Yes. We cannot do PII. That information can be whited out.
Redacted, I think.
Yeah, that's the word I'm looking for.
Yeah, we're not used to that. We're with the federal government, but we don't. We're not the Department of Defense. Are CBDO funded under the public service 15% cap?
It depends on how they're classified. If they're classified as subrecipients, they're subject to it. However, it depends on what they're carrying out. Now, I think I have the regs up on my screen. And what I'm gonna do is go to 570-204, and I'm gonna tell you where the provision is that address that. Okay. Now, 204B says, notwithstanding the CBDOs may carry out activities that are not otherwise eligible under the subpart, this section does not authorize carrying out public services that don't meet the requirements at 570-20E, except there are 2 exceptions here. Services carried out under this section that are specifically designed to increase economic opportunities through job training and placement and other employment support services, including but not limited to peer support programs, counseling, childcare, transportation, And those services, if those are carried out by a CBDO, they're not subject to the cap. Also, public services carried out pursuant to an NRSA neighborhood revitalization strategy area aren't subject to the cap. So if a CBDO is carrying out a public service in an NRSA, those public services are not subject to the cap.
Okay, here's your next
Did that
one.
answer your questions?
If not, they'll put something in the chat for us. But here's the next question. Is there a specific definition of a contractor, or can anyone be deemed a contractor?
Well, it has to be someone with the capacity to carry out whatever it is you're procuring. I mean, let me give you an example. My son has watched so much do it yourself, that he remodeled his house, his first house. Got $30,000 for it. However, my son's not a contractor, he's a musician, okay? If you were looking for someone to renovate your house, you would not choose someone like my son. He has a business, a music business, and can be a vendor, but you cannot choose him to repair your floors because that's not his area of expertise. You need, the regulations require, the Part 200 requirements, you have to make sure that you select contractors with the capacity to do what you need them to do. I mean, you can ask around, you can research it. Recommend that you research as much as possible so that you're getting someone that can act and, can actually do what it is you need them to do. As you all probably know, many of you procure contractors to do housing rehab. I'm not going to tell you how many times we've received complaints of substandard work and all of these other things because no due diligence was done to ensure that this contractor had the capacity to do what you needed it to do. I mean, anybody can hang a shingle out and say they're a contractor, anybody, but do they have the capacity to do what you need them to do? Maybe, maybe not. But in the program, you don't want maybes and hopefullys. You want a definite yes. So as you put out your RFPs and you actually have bidders responding, do some research. Ensure that, that these contractors don't have complaints, but haven't been prohibited in SAMs yet. Or I think it has a new name now. Or they just may have a bad reputation. I mean, look around, do your due diligence before you select a contractor to make sure that they have the ability to do what you need it to do.
I'll also add that if you go to the HUD exchange and you look at the NSP FAQs that are listed there, there is one that is on contractors, and that gives you a good idea of a definition of a contractor and what types of requirements that contractor should meet for your program. So obviously you're also looking at making sure they're insured and bonded and all that. So to Gloria's point, because Bob is your neighbor and he likes to drink beer and swing a hammer on the weekends, that's not your housing rehab guy. Most grantees tend to have an established list of contractors as well. In particular, if you've got a housing rehab program you're doing and you've got home funds, but that NSP FAQ will give you a better definition of what a contractor is and what you should be looking for in that. And I'm going to ask you one other question that's adjacent to that, and then we'll come back to another one on the public service cap. And that is somebody asking a question that is not new, that we get asked time to time, and that is, so can you avoid subrecipient rules by making them a contractor that fall under procurement rules?
Why would you do that?
So you can get around the regulations.
Why would you want to get around the regulate? I mean, you know, this sounds like I'm mocking you, and I'm not. But an entity that has the capacity to be a contractor can be procured and can be, there's no requirement that every contractor be a for-profit. It doesn't have to be a for-profit organization. It can be a nonprofit organization, but it has to meet the requirements at 570, 500C to be considered a subrecipient. However, as James stated, the definition of contractor is kind of broad. So how do I say this? You know,
this may be an area, Gloria.
I'm sorry?
This may be an area where we want to explore developing some policy on.
Let me write that down.
So the next question, if unspent funds from 2018 were moved to 2019 to fund a COVID response activity, along with CB funds for 2018, hit public service cap, is that still eligible?
The 18 money is subject to the cap because the CARES Act didn't provide that money would not be subject to the 15% public service cap. The CARES Act specifically says 2019 and 2020 annual appropriation CDBG funds along with CDBG-CV funds from every funding round don't have to meet public service requirement. You know, didn't have to meet, it's not subject to the cap. If you're going to do an activity to address coronavirus, it's recommended that you use 19 or 20 so that you don't have to worry about the cap.
Yeah, and in the CARES Act and in the implementation notice for CDBG-CV, 19 and 20 are the only annual funds that can take advantage of those waivers and suspensions that exist in there. So if you want to look at your program over that 6-year period from when you sign that grant agreement, there may be times that you will want to use, say, your 2022 or your 23 or 24. And I know it's hard to look 6 years out, and it seems kind of crazy, but as you kind of go along, you may be using other annual funds in that, but you have to keep in mind that you don't, even though you're leveraging those funds with your CV funds, you don't have the ability to take advantage of the waivers and suspensions. So you have to be very mindful in terms of what the activity is. If that activity involves one of those waivers and suspensions, that's only available for CDBG-CV and 2019 and 2020 annual funds that are being used to PPR the coronavirus. You don't have that flexibility with your 2022 and 21 and 23 and 24 and so on and so forth, or your 2018. So that would make the expenditures of those funds ineligible if you do that. Next question. Do subrecipients have to be a nonprofit?
Yes, because 500, 570, 500, C3, when in doubt, go to the regs. Why? Because that's your source. The regulations will always be your source.
Okay, looks like we're caught up in our Q&A.
All right, I'm sorry. What was it again, James? So I can pull up the reg. I'm sorry, I didn't get sidetracked real quick.
Oh, do subrecipients have to be a nonprofit?
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. Just that quick, okay. All right. 500C, 570, 500C. Subrecipient means a public or private nonprofit agency, authority, or organization, or a for-profit entity authorized under 572.010, receiving CDBG funds from the recipient or another subrecipient to undertake activities eligible for assistance under Subpart C. Now, when it says or a for-profit entity authorized under 572.010, there it's talking about micro enterprises. But subrecipients, as you all normally know them, are your public or private nonprofits in accordance with that regulation.
Okay, here's our next one. If you awarded 19/20 admin to purchase software in response to coronavirus and limited staff capacity, but are spending in 2021 due to time, is this subject to the 20% cap?
Okay, let me make sure. Okay.
So this is where we would actually get into the two-tier cap. But before I do that, a colleague just sent me a message and said that Part 200 has language of a contractor versus subcontractor determining based on the nature of the work they do. So we will work on putting something together on that so that we can put it out. But back to their question, Gloria, and you can chime in here as well. So that admin cap is a two-tier cap, if you will. So you have 20% that is on your grant itself, but you also have how much you can expend in any 1 year. So that's where you're kind of falling into that trap where 20% is your ceiling, if you will, for admin, regardless of what year and what you're expending that fund. Did you have anything you wanted to add to that, Gloria?
Yes, there was something that Peping explained to me, and I was trying to see if I wrote it down here. I think I wrote it down. I'd have to search email, but I don't want to take up the time to do that because that may take more time than we have. But when they are, every year they can obligate 20% from each grant. And they may not spend the money that year. For example, let's say there are 19 admin funds. And let's say that they are still expending from that now. That's fine, as long as they don't exceed the cap. I mean, I know I'm not doing the greatest job of explaining it, but generally when you're doing compliance with the caps, you're looking at what's obligated. But when they do the PR 26 and they show how much was expended, even if it's from a prior year, they can't, that origin year, they can't exceed the cap. There's a chart my colleague sent me, and I'm gonna see if I can find that and paste that in the chat. That will explain it a little better than I can. This is not an area that
we also have a section, Gloria.
Well.
On the website, we have a section on the admin caps because this is coming from our interim rule that we have that's out. So we do have training on that. We do have a guide on that as well. So in the document section on the website, we can get those things posted on there for your review. Also, as a reminder, if you have a question that you don't want to ask here, or if we tell you, we'll have to get back with you on that. And that goes the same throughout the entire training here. You can send that in through your field office. Just let them know that this was talked about during the conference and that you just wanted some clarification. You can also request that they confer with headquarters on that as well, with the program office. Our field reps handle all of CPD programs. Your current field rep you have may be more of an expert in, say, the ESG program versus the CDBG program. And at headquarters, that's all we do is CDBG in our office. Let's take on the next one here, Gloria.
All right, I was going to say, because Peping will explain more of this, I
In
think,
the IDIS section.
in her part, yeah, in financial management.
Okay. Do you have to do a debarment check in the SAM system if you have a debarment certification in the agreement and the PO?
What's a PO?
I'm assuming they probably mean a purchase order.
Well, before you can give money or award any contract or thing, you have to make sure they haven't been debarred or suspended, because the regulations prohibit using such a contractor or entity. So it's your responsibility to check in the system before you select any contractor to make sure that they haven't been debarred or suspended.
Okay, it looks like we're caught up again. We have about right around 20 minutes left. If anyone else has a question to throw in there.
Yeah, I was gonna try to cut and paste, but I don't know if I can cut and paste this. I may have to make it a resource.
All right, anybody with any questions?
Gloria, if you have a link or something, you can cut and paste it into our Zoom chat and we will relay it to the attendees. And I am sending another question right now. Just one moment.
Okay, actually, it's an Excel file. So how do I do that?
We can send that this item to have it posted on the document page on the website, the conference website.
Okay, because they may see it again during the financial man. Well, I noticed now that Peping was gonna do financial management, but now Corey is gonna be doing it, but she's still doing IDIS online. And I think there's a slide in there on this. So you may actually see this chart again, I'm not sure. But who do I email it to?
You can just send it to Lisa and Lisa will take care of it.
All right, I'll do that right now.
All right, so we have two more questions that came in.
All right.
Does admin have to be spent within the parameters of the program year? For example, if the program year starts July 1st and ends July 30th, does all admin expenses for that year have to be incurred within that time frame?
No. No. Grantees sometimes will obligate, let's say maybe 16%, 17%, or even the whole 20, but don't expend it within that program year. As long as they don't exceed the cap for that year, they can spend that money during the, the subsequent year.
So the next question is, when does the 5-day comment period waiver for CDBG-CV expire?
Well, I'm sorry, you can go ahead.
I was just going to say that that's tied to those funds, and it's in the notice. So at any time during that period, if you make an amendment, you can take advantage of the 5-day period. So it's tied to that funding pot and the notice. So it's the life cycle of your grant. The next one is, do state CDBG-CV programs need to enter their CV awards to local governments into FFATA? Which they have a new name for that now.
Oh, do they?
FFATA is part of the much larger system, which FFATA and SAMs are all combined. I wish I could remember that off the top of my head. The answer is yes, they're receiving federal funds, so they need to be entered in. So the next question, it's another procurement one.
Okay.
I know we are going to talk about procurement later, and it might cover my question. If a contractor or engineer provides a cost estimate for a project during the application process, can that same contractor or engineer apply for the project once the project is put out to bid?
No.
So yeah, so this is an interesting question, and
Matter of fact, I'm gonna get you the part 200 citation in it.
right. So in this one, Gloria, it depends on whether or not we're talking about an entitlement or a state.
Okay, because I'm not looking at it. I'm sorry.
Right. Yeah. So the entitlement, yeah, the answer is no, because it's very clear in 2 CFR Part 200 in that 320 section. For the state, they're able to actually grant an exception. And the state regulations outline how they may be able to grant that exception. I know we've gotten that question quite a bit from them. If you look at a place like Kentucky, where in the state of Kentucky, there's only say 3 or 4 firms that are willing to actually do a project within the state. And you oftentimes find a situation where they're using someone to help develop the bid specs and that, and they're the only firm willing to work in that area. They're the only firm that is willing to take on a CDBG project. So the state regulations are a little bit different than the entitlement ones in that they have the ability to grant that conflict of interest exception. And the regs walk you through how to achieve that, how to document that. So the person said that the question was talking about the state situation for an update. Yes. So so that's your answer to that one.
I'm pasting the answer from 319. I'm pasting the thing in there that says you can't use somebody that you already.
Right, and that's applicable only to the entitlement grantees.
Yes. Yes. I'm sorry, I've only worked in entitlements.
No, that's fine. That's what makes you an expert on the entitlement program. Let us know when the document is uploaded. Okay, I would say it'll probably be a little bit later today.
Yeah,
And,
I've already sent it and asked. I already sent it to my colleague and asked her to, I think there's a way to do it as a link. She said that she sent it over. She just sent me a message.
Yeah, well, it'll get posted. Just keep checking that document section. Any other questions? We got about 15 minutes left. If not, we can always end early. Then you can take a break before your next section.
Okay. Any questions?
It does not appear we're getting any new questions.
Okay.
But you can also remind them how they can always send questions. I think there's a HUD exchange site or somewhere like that.
Yes. Yeah, you can. The most appropriate place to send your questions in, of course, is through your field office. But we do have an AAQ desk as well for CDBG-CV that you can send them in through that. Well, we have another question.
One more question.
Yep. Are there procurement waivers for CARES funds?
OMB may have put some things out. We haven't done any. There are none in the notice.
Yeah, there's none in the notice. I know early on,
Requirements.
OMB had a temporary procurement waiver, but I believe it was only for federal agencies, but it has long expired. But yeah, we don't have any in our notice. All right, I guess we'll give it about another 30 seconds here, and then everyone can take a break before the next section. But while we wrap up, I really appreciate everyone this morning attending. As I said, I know it's early for a lot of people. It's been interesting to see who is on and where they are from. And some of you all get up really early. And I know yesterday there were folks on way out in our insular areas. So they probably had dinner or something and went and saw a movie and then thought, well, I'll just tune into the CARES conference. As far as our contact information, yeah, we can put that in the chat for you so that you have that. I will.
Just us or everyone?
We could just put ours in for now.
Okay, I can type mine in.
Okay. Does the chat message go to everyone, I take it?
We
will relay it to the attendees.
This
Okay.
is, somebody put this in the Q&A part, and that's where I'm put, that's where they put the question. So, I mean, because if they call our work number, they won't get us. So I'm putting my email address in here.
Okay, so I just put mine in there. Gloria's putting hers. Well, looks like we are out of questions. So again, I appreciate everyone's attendance. Just so you know, for your own information, we've had over 5,000 people registered for this conference. Our conference we did back in July, we had around 4,800. We have been hitting on our webinars that we do. We just did the subrecipient management one in a two-part series. Over the last almost 2 years now, we've seen that range go from 600 up to the 1,200 on our individual webinars we have. So to have 5,000 here at this conference is fantastic. And thank you for coming. And I hope you enjoy the rest of today and the next 2 days as well. We appreciate our grantees. You know, having been a grantee myself, I know it's a lot of work and it is some of the most rewarding work you can do. And we often find that the folks who go into this field are not only committed to the mission of serving a particular niche of the population, but you're also very intimately connected in your heart to the mission of the CDBG program. And it's worth the sacrifice. So thank you very much for everything you do. So I guess we'll go ahead and end the session and take a little break and then come back for the next one. Thanks, everyone.